Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Karim Hagag. I'm the director of the Center for American Studies and Research here at AUC. And as part of our ongoing public lecture series, it's a pleasure to welcome this afternoon Dr. Francis Oneal from the University of Alabama. Dr. Oneal is a political scientist educated at Duke University and Vanderbilt University in the United States. She has taught at the University of Alabama for 30 years, and for 12 years has directed the university's International Honors Program in the Honors College. She has taught overseas at the University of Alabama's program at Oxford University and led other study abroad programs for the university. She has hosted international scholars at the University of Alabama from Iraq, Nepal, and other nations. She previously served as a Fulbright scholar in Delhi, where she taught at Nehru University. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Oneal with us this afternoon to talk to us about a subject that has been preoccupying scholars, diplomats, policymakers for quite some time. And that is the trajectory of American foreign policy under the current administration. The title of Professor Oneal's talk with us this afternoon is "The Future of American Foreign Policy, an Unprecedented Path." That, I think, signifies what we're seeing in terms of the departure of American foreign policy from the principles and outlook that has guided American diplomacy and foreign policy over the course of the last few decades. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to our university. Thank you for coming. The floor is yours, and we very much look forward to your insight that you will provide us this afternoon.
Thank you for that warm welcome. Good afternoon. I am Fran Oneal, and it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I appreciate your coming to hear me as a Fulbright scholar on your campus. Thank you, Ambassador Hagag, and faculty and students and others for welcoming me to your beautiful campus in this wonderful and treasured world capital city of Cairo. I'm reminded of the world's indebtedness to Egypt and its culture by this scene from our university campus at the University of Alabama, where the focal point of many campus activities is an obelisk. We call it our Denny chimes, and it rings out the hours. And we can see that it is a beautiful focal point, and I'm happy to have that small link between Egyptian culture and architecture and our own campus in the state of Alabama. I greet you on behalf of not only myself, I'm so happy to be here, but also our Associate Vice President for International Education and Global Outreach, Dr. Teresa Wise, our Fulbright Liaison on campus, Dr. Beverly Falk, our Provost, Dr. Kevin Whitaker, and our University President, Dr. Stuart Bell. I'm honored to be at AUC this month to discuss the future of American foreign policy. I'm coming not as a representative of the U.S. government, but as an academic political scientist and as an ordinary American citizen. Fulbright scholars the world over come with funding and support from the U.S. government, but not with any preconditions on what we say or with whom we interact. This is emblematic of our American values, which include respect for academic freedom. I'm proud to represent that here. For me to speak on the future of American foreign policy, it's necessary to look backwards and from side to side before looking ahead. We can't speculate about the future direction of American foreign policy without looking backwards at our past record, our record of history, which of course is not static. It gains in meaning with each decade, and its lessons are different to each beholder. It's equally important in forecasting the U.S.'s foreign policy future that we look side to side. We must assess what the U.S.'s neighboring nations, what distant nations, what worldwide organizations, what shadowy organizations, what the world economy and technology and climate are telling us about the here and now. American foreign policy isn't created in a vacuum. Our policy is created in the context of the community of nations and in the context of worldwide changes, often cataclysmic, order of magnitude changes in the world that can happen unforeseen or are happening as we speak. Foreign policy making isn't done on a one-way street with a single driver at the wheel of the car. Most American leaders understand that, though some do not. In the interest of our time and your attention, I'll look backward in a few broad glances. We'll cast my eyes side to side selectively, and then we'll talk about the future. Perhaps because America is a young nation, its age is measured in a few centuries, not in many millennia, as is Egypt's, Americans are reputed to be bad at history. American school children are taught about our history in terms of presidential terms and a few grand eras. We learn about our President Washington's caution about entangling alliances. We learn about the Monroe Doctrine and Theodore Roosevelt's big stick. Americans also think in terms of eras determined by major events in international affairs. We speak of the World War II era, the Cold War era, the post-Cold War era, and the post-9/11 era. The problem is that all too many Americans, American citizens, all too often want to cling to this schoolroom version of American history and world history. Americans want a hero versus villain version of history. A version of history where God is on the side of the victors, where might makes right, and where there is evidence that America is uniquely blessed and uniquely destined in human history. A person on the street in the U.S. is likely to say, America was the good superpower during the Cold War era. America won the Cold War, and now America is the sole superpower. This level of world politics simplified appeals very broadly to the broad cross-section of American citizens. To think otherwise of our history, our nation's history, would for many Americans be unpatriotic. However, the lessons that we as political scientists, as historians, as military analysts, and others derive from our recent history don't coincide with that school book version of history. The underlying lessons may be glaringly evident to historians and political scientists, but not so to the majority of the American public. Lessons that are unwelcome to American citizens' ears may be, America can't rebuild nations in our image. America can't win an ideological war on the strength of military might alone. Economic development isn't built by American concrete and American tractors alone. America will be known by the friends we keep. So those lessons of history, from World War II, from the NATO alliance, the Vietnam War, the 9/11 attacks, that we can't win an ideological war on the strength of the military alone, or that economic development can't be built by concrete alone, those lessons may be unwelcome. They aren't popular, so politicians dare not speak otherwise in their efforts to be reelected. We know from the past 2 years' experience in the United States that our current president prefers not to look back at history. As is often reported, our current president is particularly disinterested in history, in background briefings, and in context. I offer this merely as a factual observation and recounting of his own words and actions. He declines briefings and background reports and bristles if intelligence assessments disagree with his existing views. So keep in mind at this particular juncture that Americans, and this particular American leader, are thinking of the future of American foreign policy with an abbreviated understanding of the lessons of the past and a disdain for recent precedent. So in considering the future of American foreign policy, one important lesson is that American leaders and American voters often fail to see and heed the lessons of the recent past. This simplistic form of patriotism and this unique level of hubris impede that policy-making process. Let's think then about the need to look side to side in forecasting America's foreign policy. As a child of the Cold War era myself, if I had glanced from side to side in that era, I would have indeed seen two sides. I would have seen the nations friendly toward the United States and those opposed to the United States. I would have seen the wealthy nations and the poor. I would have seen those nations in alliance with the United States and those allied with our foes. I would have seen a nuclear arms race and proxy wars. The Cold War era was tense, it was alarming, but it was knowable. It was structured, it was more black and white. Today, looking from side to side, we see more chaos, we see more fragmentation, and we see shifting allegiances. We see wealthy nations working hard to maintain their high standard of living, and formerly poor nations ascending. We see fierce internal conflicts and massive numbers of refugees from those conflicts. Some 68 million refugees worldwide by latest count. Looking side to side, we see changes in forms of government, and then some nations with all but a lack of functioning government. My current students at the University of Alabama, writing in response to articles they've read on the refugees streaming out of Syria, or those leaving Venezuela, the chaos of the Congo, the famine in Yemen, or the strict isolation of North Korea, my students will write again and again to me, I can't imagine. I can't imagine. It's their most common response. And indeed, many of us who have studied international affairs for decades likewise can't believe the degree of confusion and change that we are witnessing. Yet we need to get beyond our disbelief and look from side to side for priorities, for security concerns, for economic opportunities, and for the needs that are calling us. The future of American foreign policy will be guided by unsettled conflicts in this very region where we sit now, by an ascendant and more present China, by an assertive and authoritarian Russia, by longtime allies questioning the strength of the U.S.'s alliance commitments, by rising nationalism, by cybersecurity concerns, and by the health of the planet. These are the features on the landscape that demand our attention. But, and this is really the question on the minds of all of us today, how does the current U.S. President assess and respond to these features on the landscape? One word to describe our current president in foreign policy making choices is uncircumspect. Conferring with advisors or other heads of state or with allies are rejected as part of the current administration's process. Judicious incremental moves are often seen by this administration as signs of indecision. Foreign policy announced by Twitter has, to the dismay of the political and bureaucratic establishment, become the norm. Off-the-cuff decisions, some later to be rescinded, are part of the current process. A December 2018 pronouncement by the President that U.S. troops would be withdrawn from Syria, a pronouncement made without concurrence of the then Secretary of Defense, or a sudden reversal of the Treasury Department's additional economic sanctions on North Korea announced in March 2019 and then rolled back, are two recent and significant examples. This president was elected by promising to be unbound by history and precedent, to act decisively and to circumvent the bureaucracy. We are seeing those campaign promises kept, and frequently, in the first 2 years of this administration. Looking side to side, being circumspect, is not part of the game plan. Instead of looking from side to side for cues as to the priorities of American foreign policy, the current administration currently looks inward. The present foreign policy approach was proclaimed in style and in substance during the President's inaugural address in January 2017, when he said, "From this day forward, it's going to be only America first, America first. It was a foreign policy message that could only have fallen easily on the ears of his domestic base of supporters. For many other Americans and for the rest of the world, those words fell heavily. What has America First as the essential message and approach to foreign policy meant? It's meant balking against multilateralism, investing high stakes on leader-to-leader direct diplomacy, veering sharply away from inherited foreign policy agreements, rattling the cages of even our most trusted, long-time, stable allies. And as all observers have noted, it has meant a transactional approach to international relations. One of the greatest concerns observed by those who are observing the impact of America First as a basis for our foreign policy is the erosion of the United States soft power. Soft power derives from the United States leadership, its reliability, trustworthiness, long-term relationships, goodwill, and confidence in the United States direction. Soft power is undermined by unpredictability, disregard for long-term relationships, and erratic moves. The decisions in just the first 2 years of the current administration to rewrite NAFTA, to leave the Trans-Pacific Partnership, to abrogate the JCPOA and the INF, not to accede to the Paris Climate Accords, and to challenge NATO members. These are departures from high-profile and, in most cases, long-established agreements and alliances. In pursuit of better deals that will put America first, the United States shifts in these foreign policies have rocked many boats and threatened to sink the vessel of soft power. For an administration that believes in driving a hard bargain and pressing one's advantage, the value of soft power, with that very unappealing soft term, is not a concern. The policies pronounced are those that put America first, and I expect you to do the same, said the President to the world's leaders at the UN General Assembly in 2017 and again in 2018. In the latter speech, he referred to America's policy of principled realism, adding that we will not be held hostage to old dogmas, discredited ideologies, and so-called experts who have been proven wrong over the years, time and time again. The foreign policy paradigm of the current administration is transactional, not ideological. What can the U.S. offer with considerable calculation towards a bilateral relationship or multilateral organization? And what does the U.S. get in return? This transactional approach is seen not only in demanding greater financial contributions from NATO allies, but in such arenas as foreign aid. As our President said to the United Nations again in 2018, the United States is the world's largest giver by far of foreign aid, but few give anything to us. That's why we are taking a hard look at foreign assistance, end quote. Foreign policy decision-making based on a transactional approach and so-called principled realism discounts the long-term benefits of the soft power gained through foreign assistance or long-term alliances by looking only at present-day costs and benefits. Many who work in diplomacy, the intelligence services, or the military in America, many such as former Ambassador to Russia, William Burns, feel that America is squandering its goodwill and allowing for, quote, corrosive damage to America's image in the minds of the rest of the world. We are losing the capacity to invest in alliances and mobilize other countries with the America First principle guiding our foreign policy. In terms of respect for what this president has inherited as the norms of foreign policy making, our alliances, our trade arrangements, and the like, It's safe to say that precedent was made by very weak people. Previous alliances and treaties are bad deals, and the media's versions of events are fake. As citizens, we in America expect our president to give due regard to our national values of democracy, freedoms, and human rights in presenting the face of America to the world. Our current president sees these values as less relevant, irrelevant perhaps, in creating deals and making relationships with other nations. One of my first points to you today was that America, out of simple patriotic loyalty, often doesn't learn the lessons of history well. And in the eyes of the present administration, our recent history is full of embarrassments and weaknesses to be remedied. You may have heard that view expressed by the administration right here on this very campus. A second point to you today is that we as Americans, as academics, lawmakers, journalists, judges, diplomats, economists, lawyers, we still operate on the basis of respect for precedent and see the U.S.'s interests in the context of the community of nations. Thus, many Americans find ourselves stunned by the new voice of American foreign policy. It's abundantly clear that there is grassroots popular support for our duly elected president, and that he has a committed cadre in his administration. Around the country, though, many Americans are stunned. Our expectations of how foreign policy is made and conducted are confronted with an iconoclastic administration determined to exhibit American strength through bold, decisive, unpredictable, and unorthodox decisions. A third point I'll make now is that the American government and American citizens are responding to challenges presented by these changes in the executive branch with the rules and processes that have long stood in place in our country. Those rules and processes are holding firm. Iconoclastic actions are meeting with prompt, legal, institutional resistance. We have no history as a nation of iconoclasm. Our Constitution is iconic. Our checks and balances are iconic. The role of the free press is iconic. Our principles are holding firm in their defense. Our courts, the Congress, and the electorate are fully engaged. By way of forecasting the immediate future of American foreign policy, I point to the spoken intent and the actions of this administration to engage in overall retrenchment in American policy in the Middle East, American involvement in the Middle East and globally. The withdrawal from the JCPOA, from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, from the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations, and the withdrawal of funding for UNICEF, the drawdown of troops in Syria and Afghanistan, all point in this direction. At the same time, I will point out that the budget of the Defense Department is being bolstered mightily, and that of the State Department is recommended to be slashed. But this announced intent to retrench our involvement in the Middle East doesn't meet with universal support in the United States. The well-known journal Foreign Affairs recently surveyed a broad panel of 32 influential U.S.-based Middle East regional experts, including government officials, military persons, and academicians. They were asked to agree or disagree with the statement, quote, the United States should stop trying to solve the regional problems of the Middle East, end quote. The 32 experts split themselves evenly across the spectrum, 15 disagreeing with the statement, and 14 agreeing, and 3 neutral on the statement. Those who advocated for a lessened U.S. presence cited the inefficacy and lack of clear results, some using the words disasters or making things worse, from years of military involvement, diplomacy, and aid in this region. Those who advocated for a steady U.S. presence cited the instability that would arise from a power vacuum left by a future U.S. withdrawal, and the need to pursue our obligations, aims, and interests in the region. The need to invest more effort in diplomacy and development in the region is a common theme for those who advocate for a continued American role in the Middle East. There's not a clear consensus then that the administration's professed intent to retrench from heavy commitments in this region will meet with sustained support over time. In the longer term, it's clear that the future of American foreign policy will be shaped by younger Americans, and perhaps sooner rather than later. Every nation suffers from some form of gerontocracy, leadership by older elected officials chosen by older voters, or by unchosen autocrats who sit firmly in office. The U.S. is not different. We too suffer from gerontocracy. Yet at no time that I know of since the Vietnam War are younger voters more energized and supercharged about participating in politics, both by voting and by running for office. The results can be seen already. The midterm elections in 2018 brought into office a much younger wave of members of Congress. In political science, we have often and for decades decried America's inattentive public, the inactive voters, and the general political apathy of American citizens. It's clear now that the energy of the youth vote and the next generation of young political leaders will shape American foreign policy, both domestic and foreign. The electorate is energized. There's a strong divergence in opinion on the direction of U.S. foreign policy between older American voters and younger American voters. The Pew Research Center's surveys tell us that 64% of older Americans believe that a top policy priority should be maintaining a U.S. military advantage over all nations. Only 30% of younger Americans agree with that statement. 64% versus 30%. Younger persons are also less likely to hold the view of American exceptionalism. Only a third as many younger Americans as older Americans see the U.S. as standing alone above all other nations. A younger electorate and a younger set of political leaders will have no memory of the Cold War imperative for the U.S. to be militarily present around the globe, nor will their policy preferences be driven by a sense of American exceptionalism. Further, America will, by the year 2040, be what we call a majority-minority nation demographically. African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, and others will together be the numeric majority. That will be felt in our nation's priorities going forward. The youth vote and the diversity vote are the coming tidal wave. As one example, comprehensive immigration reform, one that addresses the competing calls for merit-based versus humanitarian-based preferences, and the counter calls to shut the door behind us. That immigration reform will come sooner rather than later, given the demographic and ethnic shifts in our population. What are the challenges ahead for the future of American foreign policy? Given that both a sense of history and regional expertise are going to be needed to guide American foreign policy, perhaps not in this administration, but as we make adjustments for future administrations, I believe that rebuilding U.S. soft power is going to be vital. The return of Fulbright scholars to Egypt is one tiny step in that direction. The rebuilding of the State Department and its personnel is truly a great task ahead. As a State Department insider recently described it to me, our bench is gone. That's a U.S. sports metaphor, meaning that we don't have enough talented persons waiting in the wings We don't have the depth of expertise on which we normally rely for the conduct of foreign affairs. When Secretary of State Rex Tillerson left office in the State Department over a year ago, 8 out of 10 top positions in the department were still vacant. Still today, 30% of Assistant Secretary of State positions are unfilled, including a key position here in Egypt. The administration appears poised to succeed in eroding the capabilities of existing institutions, I quote, despite its haphazard efforts to control the foreign policy bureaucracy. That trend must be reversed. And much remains to be done to restore the United States' soft power, its reliability in the eyes of its allies, and its image as a world leader on behalf of democracy. Not only through our research and writing, our meetings, our panels, our scholarly exchanges, do we in academia shape the future of American foreign policy. It's in the preparation of future members of our foreign service and related agencies that you and I as academics shape that future. My role is to inspire and motivate students from the U.S. and from the University of Alabama in particular to study the world far from home. My role here is to serve as a Fulbright scholar, to represent the diversity of the American public and our freedom to express our views. My role at home is to inspire my students to do the same as Fulbright scholars themselves and as future foreign policy makers. Your role and my role is to make sure that the bench, the next cohort of international relations specialists, does not remain depleted. I would propose to you today that we can see 2 signs of strength and vitality in American democracy at the current moment. We can see that the American popular will is successfully voiced through voting and is not co-opted by the left or the right, liberal or conservative. We see wide swings and sometimes wild swings in who is favored and what policies are favored by the American electorate. This indicates the openness of the American system, the fact that there is no lock on power by any one voice in society. And the independent judiciary, the state-level governments, and the free press are carrying out their legal obligations and are upholding their traditional roles as part of our democracy. They are circumspect. They are heedful of precedent. They are mindful of the long-term interests of our nation and our place among nations. America has as its leader a bold president, an activist president, a strong-willed president, and an iconoclastic president. But we are not a government of one person. The future of American foreign policy, it's my belief, it's my hope, will be representative of a younger, more diverse, more circumspect, more politically engaged American public, more mindful of our mutual interests with our friends and allies. And it's my hope that our American foreign policy will embody, more so than ever, our ideals of democracy, freedom, and the rights of all humanity. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Professor Oneal. You've given us much food for thought in trying to think about how American foreign policy will be shaped in the future, what outlook will govern perhaps the foreign policy for the remainder of this administration and perhaps future administrations.
It's possible.
But I was hoping to draw your attention back to our region, the Middle East. You referenced the Middle East in the context of your remarks. And I was wondering if you could perhaps help us understand more about the implications of this administration's foreign policy for our region. And I would ask you 2 questions. First, we've seen the trajectory of this administration's foreign policy towards the Middle East. in a way that has really been quite disruptive of how the United States has approached the Middle East and the problems of the Middle East moving forward. We've seen that specifically in the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict, reflected most clearly in the decision to relocate the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. We've seen how this administration seems to lack an interest in the future of the region moving forward. We've seen it in the attitude towards refugees, the attitude towards Islam as a religion, the approach, the very belligerent approach to Iran, as you mentioned, the further decline of soft power, American soft power in the Middle East, whereas to begin with, American soft power in our region has faced real limitations. How should the region cope with what seems to be a fundamental change in American foreign policy towards our region? Related to that is my second question, and that touches on Egypt. So Egypt is a country that has invested heavily in its relationship with the United States. The United States and Egypt have been partners on issues of Arab-Israeli peace, regional security, counterterrorism, development, and economic assistance. And like many allies of the United States, Egypt is now looking as how best to position itself with this administration, given the departures in American foreign policy. What advice would you give Egypt in how to approach this administration and the fundamental shifts we're seeing in American foreign policy? What should Egypt do?
All right, thank you for two very important questions. First, you're correct that the Middle East region has always been a difficult and complicated place, not only for the United States, but for all outside actors within the region. Relationships are very complex within this region and often conflictual. Knowing the worldview of the current administration, the current administration will take a very simplified view of the Middle East and will focus on those nations where it has the greatest alliance, similarity of worldview, and compatibility, so Saudi Arabia and Israel. Those will be the areas where this administration feels comfortable visiting first, as the first overseas visit of the United States to Saudi Arabia, and in promoting the strength and solidarity of the regimes in power, view the outcome of this week's elections in Israel, bolstering Netanyahu's fortunes, which were not solid prior to considerable support and bolstering from the United States and decisions such as the move of the capital to Tel Aviv. So the U.S. focus will be simplified, streamlined, feeling that there's much to be gained from those long-time partnerships with Saudi Arabia and with Israel, and other nations in the region will begin to suffer from lesser attention and more less nuanced attention from this administration. Nations will be pocketed into categories of friendly and unfriendly rather than relationships that we're nurturing and trying to help evolve over time. So looking at remarks of this administration, our current Secretary of State, Pompeo, about Iran, there's no consideration of promoting a more cooperative relationship, pulling that regime in Iran closer to cooperation with the U.S. or with anyone else in the region. It's simply written off into a very simplified black and white category and into the category of the greatest threat to the region, not one of the greatest three threats to the world. So we can expect a very simplified set of categories for nations in this region. And Egypt will be seen as, of course, one of our continued allies and partners, but Egypt will, for the next 2 years at least, need to talk the language of transaction. that this is what we have been able to offer. This is how friendly we've been able to help keep the region for Israel. If possible, educate the administration on the contributions that Egypt has made over the years since the Camp David Accords in keeping this region a safe place for the nation of Israel. So learning to talk the language of this administration is vital. The president likes to see results, likes to see what's received in return. So speaking to the higher growth rate of the Egyptian economy, the fact that Egypt has provided this buffer for the state of Israel will be the only way to maintain the positive intentions of the administration.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's wise advice that should be considered. Thank you, Professor Oneal. I invite our guests to pose questions from the floor, if there are questions. Yes, sir.
So we talked about like in the future, the youth who are like less American first and are more like about us, like equality and all of that. But like there's going to be a decrease like in military presence and like around the world. So like we see a decrease in American hegemony. How, like my first part of the question is, how do you think like who will step in for this gap? That's the first part. And if someone doesn't step in, will there be something like the Woodrow Wilson's like affair, by means that there's no buffer, and so there's no like a certain centralized hegemony in the middle that's trying to control things, and so people like end up fighting together on various issues.
Right. Thank you. I had this discussion with a class of students yesterday who are studying international policy in this region, and we discussed the difficulty that the American public and the American political system, all American political leaders will have in adjusting to the idea of a post-U.S. hegemonic world, a more multipolar world, a more multi-actor world. All hegemonies come to an end. The United States likes to think that as an exceptional nation that our hegemony may not come to an end. But I think a younger cohort of Americans is less wedded to that worldview and will find it less disconcerting to see a world where the United States doesn't play a hegemonic role in every region of the world. In our current international power landscape, it seems that Russia is the power most interested in asserting a more pronounced presence in this region, a region where they've traditionally had a very, very, very limited presence. So the most likely influencer, if we want to use that word, the most likely new influencer in the Middle East region will be Russia. The current American administration might not have trouble with that. The State Department, the Defense Department will be more resistant to that, but the executive branch may be willing to say that we can see the role that Russia played in Syria, and we're willing to accept that on a more extensive basis. So Russia, we would see, is the most likely regional influencer for this region. Was there another part of your question?
And what if like no one fills the gap? What do you think like would happen to an international community?
There's a possibility of the rise of a more globally active, engaged China, but China seems intently focused on economic involvement. We could use the word hegemony, economic presence throughout the globe, particularly in Africa and in Central Asia and South Asia. Those ambitions could certainly spread globally. So we see less interest in China in a militarized role worldwide, with the exception of the Pacific Ocean area, the South Pacific. But it's possible that China will be seen as the economic hegemonic power of the 21st century. We in America are perhaps best positioned to not rise to that challenge, but to match China's reassertive economic role, because we do have a young, vital, innovative population innovation is perhaps one of the most admirable characteristics of American societies. We're innovative in many, many regards, the sciences, economic and business models, and in the arts. So we are an innovative society, we're young, creative, and perhaps the greatest stimulus to the new innovation, the 21st century innovation in the United States is our immigrant population. Many of the leaders of the most successful Silicon Valley corporations and the largest corporations in the United States are themselves immigrants or the sons and daughters of immigrants in the United States. So immigration reform in the United States governed by a more wisely informed policy, a more adapted policy for the 21st century could help spur that continued innovation nexus within the United States and help us maintain a parity level with China going forward.
Maybe related to that, you spent some time explaining to us the animating ideas that guide this administration's foreign policy. Nationalism, populism, America first, the transactional approach to foreign policy. But you also mentioned something that was, I think we should spend more time on. You alluded to the rise of other voices and other constituencies that present a worldview that challenges this approach. A more diversified America, a younger demographic, a rising demographic. Among those constituencies, what are the competing worldviews and the animating ideas that propel those worldviews that pose a challenge to this administration's overall outlook to foreign policy and world affairs?
The younger and more diverse group of leaders in Congress and the younger and more diverse voters who elected them are very concerned about climate change, and that's certainly not a priority of the current administration. It's not a reality for the current administration. So that will be a foreign policy focus that this younger cohort tries to drag the United States back into the Paris Climate Accords and back into a leadership role. I think that can be successful, even for those with an America First point of view, if we can harness the profitability of adapting to climate change, the economic and business opportunities that lie in adjusting to change. So China has taken the lead in creating fleets of electronic vehicles, e-cars, and is going to profit mightily from that, taking a leaf out of their notebook. The United States can bring on board more of the American public to support a climate change friendly set of policies by saying, look how we can gain from evolving economically in that direction, pointing to the profitability and the benefits of a more positive proactive climate change set of policies. The younger demographic will struggle with the orientation that they will naturally have towards a globalist United States, a more globally engaged United States, participating heavily in multilateral efforts worldwide to keep the peace or to resolve conflicts, and multinational organizations. With domestic interests, we have many seething domestic interests in the United States to be addressed. So I believe the younger and more diverse population in the United States has a naturally globalist orientation, but we have serious issues to address at home, such as rebuilding our infrastructure that will compete for their efforts and attention, for what they campaign upon, what they make as their hallmark. So that will be, I think that the natural orientation is globalist in outlook, but time and effort will be spent on domestic issues.
Sir, there was a question.
Ms. Barber, Political Science. Hi.
Hello.
So I'd like you to put your finger on a tension that you've already exposed and that this question has raised, which is on the one hand, demographic change resulting in different opinions, and yet on the other hand, the weakening of the State Department and populist rhetoric from Republican president. So One of the things that I understand Donald Trump to have done is to change the modus vivendi with respect to foreign affairs. Namely, in America, we're concerned more about domestic affairs. It's the economy, stupid. And foreign policy is made by experts with regional knowledge, not necessarily something that the public has. So we might see the youth growing into positions in a more powerful State Department, etc. But will that solve the problem of populist rhetoric in foreign policy making?
Well, I will point out that populist rhetoric isn't unique to the United States at this moment in world history. There are more populist candidates being elected worldwide in a wide diversity of countries, so we're part of an international pendulum swing. And my guess, as an informed academic, is that it has to do with fundamental economic foundational shifts that have caused many groups in the population to feel disoriented, dislocated, and undervalued, and that a generational shift, once it's passed, will allow those economic foundational shifts to be less motivating of people's outlook. So older workers feel displaced from an economic model that they understood and are being forced to rapidly adapt to global competition and less labor-intensive forms of livelihood. Once that economic model is established in the minds of a generation that's less threatened by it, then I would hope that populism will recede. It is a pendulum swing that we've seen in history. We know that populism waxes and wanes. This one came on very quickly, very suddenly, and has garnered popular support from Hungary to Poland to any number of European countries as well as the United States. So I think that economic forces may be driving the populist tendencies that we hear now, the populist voices we hear now, and we hope that with a generational shift that they will be less prominent.
Thank you. If there are no final questions from the floor, allow me to thank you for your thoughts, your insight, and for making sense for us of what seems to be a complicated context when it comes to American foreign policy looking forward. If I could ask you to please join me in thanking Professor Oneal for being here with us today. Thank you.
I thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so
Pleasure.
much. And thank you all for joining us today.